Okay, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to thank you all for being here this afternoon and welcome you to the Global Development Forum 2016. I know you've had a really exciting morning already, and we look forward to keeping that going through the afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Sarah Ladislaw. I direct the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS. Very, very pleased to be part of the forum today and to have such a great panel to talk about some of the challenges at the nexus between energy and development. We, not too long ago here at CSIS, hosted the U.S. Energy Information Administration's International Energy Outlook. This is their forecast looking globally, trying to figure out what energy demand is going to be around the world, looking now until 2040. And to no one's surprise, everybody here in the room follows the energy and development space. Clearly, energy demand is going to continue to rise, somewhere on the order of 48% between now and 2040. And that a huge portion of that development is increasingly coming from the non-OECD community. And so that's been a phenomenon that we've been experiencing now for over the last decade, and it's had some real and important commercial and economic and market-based and also foreign policy implications. And so one of the things we're really excited today to talk about is how different actors, different players on the global stage are working together to not only try to meet those energy and development needs, but to also do it within sort of an ever increasingly complicated governance and policy and commercial landscape. As we know, there is a broad imperative given to the international community that many people within the commercial sectors follow, which is to increase energy access, in fact, ensure universal access by 2030, and to generally improve access to higher quality fuels, to more modernized energy infrastructure and services, and to do all of that within the context of a very turbulent world. And one in which technology continues to evolve, and we also have a greater and greater impetus to do so in a way that is environmentally sound and takes into consideration the issues of climate change as well. So certainly a robust landscape, and I can't think of 5 better people to spend the afternoon with to talk about some of those issues. The only catch is we don't have the whole afternoon, and we could probably occupy all of it. We only have about an hour. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panelists very quickly, just so you know who everybody is. We're very lucky to have them here today with their time. And then I'm going to ask a couple of questions. We'll have a little bit of a discussion, and then we'll sort of open it up for all of you. I do encourage you, when you're asking a question, to speak into the microphone. We have a large audience watching on webcast, and it's very important that they get to hear your insights as well. So right to my immediate left, we've got Beth Tritter, who's the Vice President for the Department of Policy and Evaluation at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And to her left, we've got Tracey Webb, who's the Vice President for Structured Finance and Insurance at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And then we've got Raval, who's the Senior Vice President in Communications of Public Affairs for Symbion Power, and has been here before in his previous roles as part of Power Africa. And then we've got Pamela Farrell, who is Director of Global Government Affairs and Policy at GE, and fresh back from a trip to India, which hopefully she'll tell us a little bit about. And then Ethan Zindler, who is works at Bloomberg New Energy Finance and runs a project called Climate Scope that he's going to talk a little bit about today. He's an affiliate with the energy program at CSIS and really has really pioneered the work that BNEF has done on looking at the competitive landscape for clean energy and energy efficiency technologies in some of the developing world context. So let's just get started with a general question, right? I laid out some of the key underpinnings that everybody sort of understands at the nexus of the energy and development space. One, that we presume that energy demand is going to continue to grow, and that but that landscape for being able to ensure access to financing and infrastructure, to sort of the commercial frameworks and technologies that will enable energy to be able to reach a wide variety of populations needs to continue to happen. I'd just like each of you to spend just a couple of minutes talking about how you play a role in overcoming some of those challenges, both where you do it, how you do it, and why you think that it is unique. So Beth, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm excited to talk a little bit about how MCC looks at this issue and what our approach is. For those of you who aren't familiar with MCC, we're an independent US government agency with one mission, which is reducing poverty through economic growth, and therefore you can see how energy might figure prominently into what we do. We're heavily invested in Africa. About two-thirds of our portfolio is in Africa. And right now we're actually pretty heavily invested in energy as well, with about 5 compacts and 1 threshold program focusing on energy, and another one in development that's also focused on energy, or at least in part focused on energy. And we're very selective with who we work with. So we only work with poor countries that are good performers relative to their peers in areas such as economic freedom, democratic governance, and investing in their people. And so we have some basic eligibility requirements. Once a country is selected for a partnership with MCC, we then go in and let the economics really drive what the investments are going to be. And so it's no surprise that when we go in and look at what the key constraints to economic growth are in our partner countries, we find that energy is time and time again one of those key constraints. And very often, and in fact I would say in all cases, it's a combination of things. We don't look at energy differently than we look at any other sector necessarily. It's a combination of what infrastructure gaps are there, what service delivery gaps there are, and also what policy and institutional reform barriers, what sectoral governance barriers there are to creating a fruitful environment for the private sector to come in. And that's really how we approach all things, but that's definitely how we approach energy. So what you'll see is in our investments in countries like Ghana, in countries like Malawi, in Benin, that what we're doing is a combination of infrastructure, whether that's generation, transmission, or distribution, and policy and institutional reform. And we understand that our job is not to replace what the private sector would do, or even what the government should be doing, although certainly our partner governments often need a leg up and need some help in order to do the jobs that they should be doing as governments. So we focus on those things. We focus on helping the governments provide better services and better infrastructure for their own people, helping them create a better environment for the private sector to come in and thrive. And then we like to crowd in private investment along with our investments. And those are the types of things that we focus on, not replacing the private sector, but actually enabling it. MCC has a real focus on good governance. It's one of our key eligibility factors. It's what that's not even talking about off-grid. And the other underpinning factor to that, which I think we all know, is infrastructure is recognized as one of those pillars of development that actually leads to progress in long-term living standards for everyone. So it's an important focus of the agency. And we achieve that, which I agree with Beth, good governance helps a lot. But the other lesson that I've learned from 22 years of investing in emerging markets at OPIC is nothing can substitute for a good entrepreneur and a good opportunity. And when you get those combination, it really is something special. And I have seen it succeed in environments where you never expect it would. But when you start getting the combination, again, I think you get more broad-based progress.
Well, maybe not to put words in your mouth, but fitting into that category of good entrepreneurs with good opportunities, I think Symbion is
developing a 600 megawatt power project using natural gas from Nazi Bay. In Rwanda, there is a lake Kivu, which has a naturally occurring methane gas at the bottom of the lake, and we're developing a project to siphon the methane gas, bring it to the surface, and then use that as a fuel source for onshore turbines. So, and then moving on to Madagascar, where there's really a paucity of electricity access there, as you know. We're rehabilitating a 40 megawatt power plant there, and then making progress in developing some other projects throughout the country. In terms of development policy, there are a few points that have to be made in reference to sub-Saharan Africa, and that's really only I can only talk about sub-Saharan Africa because that's where most of our projects are. The first is don't refer to Africa, or don't think about Africa as one big country in terms of development policy, and that happens time and time again in policy briefings, in events such as these, and behind closed doors in private sector meetings. Every country in in that continent is completely different than other. Obviously, there are linkages, there are a great deal of sort of things they have in common, but it's important to look at each country separately in terms of its governance abilities, in terms of its ability to finance projects, funding, and things like that. In terms of looking at these countries, it's important to use, in our opinion, to use natural resources, the existing natural resources that exist in each of these countries. And that does include things like heavy fuel oil and coal, because the needs, and I don't need to tell anybody in this audience, the needs for electricity access throughout the continent, and specifically in those countries that I mentioned and other countries, are so enormous that you really have to take an all-of-the-above approach. And I'm very heartened that in the recently passed Electrify Africa legislation that President Obama signed into law, that all-of-the-above approach in terms of using biomass, solar, hydro, coal, and other fuel sources was signed into law for here in terms of policy. It's also important to look at it in terms of cost effectiveness. And it's important to realize that when you're importing fuel sources into countries, you're not investing in those countries per se, and that money will go out of these countries. So it's important to use those natural resources in that context as well. And it's also more cost effective. Mm-hmm. In some cases, if you build a 20 megawatt solar powered plant, the tariff on that could be upwards of 18, 19 cents. Whereas in a place like Tanzania, where at our power plant, where President Obama helped launch Power Africa, and in which we use GE turbines, in that circumstance, that's the lowest tariffs in the entire country in terms of cost per kilowatt hour. We're using natural gas in that regard. So it's important to look at those things in that context as well. And finally, it's important to also look at in terms of corporate social responsibility efforts. Mm-hmm. That is clearly part of development efforts. And American private sector partners, whether it's GE or Symbion, are building corporate social responsibility projects in sub-Saharan Africa. We have a large youth sports park located in the middle of Dar es Salaam. We partnered with the NBA and Sunderland Football Club of the English Premier League to allow free access, open to everybody, in Tanzania to use FIFA qualified soccer field programs for girls and for the disabled, elite academies as well associated with the project. So that's all very important because it's part about investing in the community. There's no direct correlation per se to energy. But if you think about it, you're developing the next generation of Tanzanians by providing these kinds of opportunities, athletic, in this context that they didn't have before. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Avi. That's fantastic. I want to get back to, in our second round of questions, some of your concepts of national context and sort of understand how understanding that is so important for doing the work that all of you do. But, Pamela, you just, as I alluded to, just got back from India. You guys have a really interesting focus on the kind of work that you think you can do there. Would you talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I want to get back to some of the things that we're doing in country and how some of the developing countries are being so smart about this opportunity. They're not standing there with their hand out. They know what they have, a lot of demand. They know that we want to provide solutions, and they're being smart about that. So I'll talk about it in the next round. So GE Power is the company that I work for, and it's a $30 billion energy technology company. We are the all-of-the-above technology provider. We do gas, we do steam, we do both traditional and distributed power, renewables, and nuclear. So generally the way we look at it is we're not there to tell you what to use. We're there to help you use what fuel source you decide in the most efficient and the cleanest way possible. It's a great message to take around the world. And I'm feeling very weary and jet lagged from traveling. Let's see. So as you all know, the mature markets, not a lot of energy demand. So as the global government relations leader for the business, I'm everywhere else. So I've spent a lot of time in ASEAN, Africa, China, and India most recently. And what we see there in India is really interesting, a really tough challenge, and we have to think about how we're going to go after that. So what I would say is, for countries like India, that have the greatest demand, and you can extend this to other, Nigeria, Pakistan also, really growing economies, great power demand. They're among the least credit-worthy countries, and they have the weakest government institutions. In India, I might give them a little more credit and say that they're complex. They're extremely complex and decentralized. So when we're looking at doing a big power solution, and that's what we want to do, right? We want to be a partner. Selling the way we traditionally do, the way that my company is comfortable doing, is we like to sell technology to a developer that's then going to build and potentially operate the plant. We're not interested in being the project manager or bringing together multiple solutions and maybe even being part of the solution on increasing their collectibles. But hey, that's what they need, right? This isn't a simple, how do we get power to this place or the other? It's how do we get power there, and how do we make it a functioning system? And that starts with the foundation of the grid, then the power generation, and then ultimately getting the energy paid for by the consumers. And that's just huge. It's a huge challenge. And so one of the things that my team is focusing on very intensely is how we can build partnerships with the development community, with the financial development community, because as you said, in a lot of these cases, we're prohibited from going in on our own. So we do need support, although we have a very substantial financial services business still in the energy group. In order to go into some of these markets, we have to either go in with an ECA or some other type of financial institution. Don't want to run too long, but what I wanted to say really is, in order to create the momentum and really drive companies like GE and others to get into a space they're not comfortable in, to make us kind of push ourselves into the space of being the project managers, the developers, and bringing in all of these technology solutions together. We do grid, we do power generation, we also do financing, we also do clean water. Coming up with projects that encompass all of that, where we take a little more stake, is a possibility, but it would be best if we're partnering with the expertise within the development community, as well as financial institutions that are willing to take on something as big as that. And I think that gets back to the government piece, the policy piece, because what's going to work there? I can spend all of my time traveling to the States and India, trying to come up with policies that work for each individual one, but ultimately the solution, I feel, is going to be one where they can turn it over. They can say, we agree on what we need, you'll be a part of this broad scale solution, and we'll be the beneficiary, because managing the grid, buying the power generation, and receiving the collectibles have all been disparate and a challenge.
That's great. Well, it's certainly an indicator of why it's so important to have some of these partnerships, which I think we should talk a little bit about as well, because it's not, as you said, it's not your business to want to run that system, but you have an interest in whether it runs well. So that's certainly an important point we should pick up on. Ethan, you're not selling anything to anybody other than analysis, huh?
Yeah. That's right. I'll say some of that.
But it's pretty good. It's pretty good analysis. Why don't you talk about, I think most people know what Bloomberg New Energy Finance is, but one of the reasons we wanted you, to certainly be part of this conversation is you guys are trying to inform in a way, the governance structure and the commercial frameworks for a lot of these places by making information that wasn't previously out there and collated out there. And so could you talk a little bit just about what you've done and what you think some of the core insights that have come out of it are?
Sure, thanks. So for those who don't know, Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a division of Bloomberg LP, and we're basically an energy market research firm with a heavy emphasis and focus on the clean energy markets. And we have folks in about a dozen offices around the world, including 4 or 5 in Asia and 2 in Africa as well. So as Sarah mentioned, what we do for our living is we provide in-depth research about what's going on in the energy markets, primarily to private sector players who want to make a return on investment. So to some large degree, that has been focused on the most developed markets out there. We've also always done a lot on emerging markets, but to really dig in and to learn a lot more, we've really undertaken 2 key projects. One's Climate Scope, which is a project that's been supported by the UK government, by USAID, and by the Inter-American Development Bank over the last 5 years or so. And the other is a report that we put out, and I don't know how much you know about this, Sarah, but I'll fill you in, which is on the sort of the off-grid lighting developments as well, which we've done with the IFC and the World Bank. So Climate Scope's goal really is to inform policymakers, investors, and others about market conditions in 53 emerging markets around the world. And we just basically gather a tremendous amount of data. Literally, as I speak, I think there's about 10 of my colleagues in countries in sub-Saharan Africa and states in India and elsewhere gathering information for the next release of the report, which will be in November. And the goal, of course, is just to basically make a whole lot of information available to all kinds of folks, including, of course, our clients and those who are in the private sector, so that they have a clear sort of sense as to where the opportunities now lie in these different countries for making investments in energy in particular. So there's, by way of background, that's what we've done. And I guess a couple real very basic points that sort of been hit on before, but I think are worth reminding everyone on, which is this is where the energy markets are going to grow over the next 25 years. And I see why you're logging the hours on the plane, because frankly, here in the US, our forecast over the next 25 years is basically that power demand kind of does this, and then it actually does this. It really it's been pretty much flat the last 5 years, and it's not really going to grow very much in the long term. So if you're in the energy business, then your business is in India, it's in sub-Saharan Africa, it's in China, it's other places like that. So that's where your emphasis and your focus is. And already I would note that as we think about right now, and again, a lot of our focus is on renewables and clean energy, already the majority of investment that we're seeing right now in new power generating projects is taking place in emerging markets. And the majority of clean energy investment is taking place in emerging markets, largely because of China, should be noted, but there's a lot of activity going on in other countries as well. I guess the question is why? Why is there clean energy activity happening in these countries? The conventional wisdom, I would say, but many people say, is that there's this kind of dichotomy between development and doing clean energy. If you want to do development, you do cheap coal. If you want to do clean energy, you're a rich country, and that's what you can afford. And that's unfortunately been the conventional wisdom for a while. It is, I would argue, completely false now. Many of these countries have some of the best natural resources in the world to take advantage of. The costs of clean energy have gone down very, very dramatically. And the local cost of power in some of these countries is so exceptionally high, thanks to reliance on things like diesel generation and other things, that there's a great opportunity to come in and underprice if you're on the renewable side. So it's a very exciting time in terms of the type of opportunities that we see that are out there. And I think one last point, and then I'll stop, which is that I think a lot of our conversation so far, and I imagine will continue to be about the sort of large-scale power generating projects, the hub and spoke type systems that we all know so well about. But there is an interesting real revolution out there brewing, much more from the ground up, involving the 1.3 billion people who have basically no access to any kind of energy at all right now, and a number of very small companies that are getting out there and getting out these tiny micro solar lanterns. These are not systems that you would necessarily, run 3 TVs off of, but they're enough to turn on a light, charge your cell phone, maybe do 1 or 2 other things, but they're basically like a box with a battery, a small panel, maybe the size of this table, and you have given somebody a lot more energy access than they had, a week ago earlier. No longer does someone have to do a 2-mile walk to go charge their phone at the local store or anything like that. And those companies are raising money through venture capital. Some cases they're definitely getting help from the World Bank and others as well, but a lot of it is happening very organically. We probably expect about 100 million of these systems to get distributed around the world this year, and it's a very exciting and interesting thing. It is obviously not the end-all be-all goal for development. If you want to get people truly onto the grid, it's not that, but it is an important step up, and it's a lot cleaner than burning diesel, than burning wood, burning any other number of different things. So that's an exciting area that I would ask everyone to at least keep an eye on.
That's excellent, Ethan. In fact, one of the reasons why we keep you around is you're very productive even when you don't know it. I think that's a great question to sort of pose back to everybody here, because it does encapsulate a lot of what we've been talking about so far, which is there is a bit of a tension, right, or a perceived tension between the pace and scale of development needs and the rapid change that we're seeing within the electric power sector, especially in a developing country context, but really just also with putting the climate lens on a lot of the development community as well. There is at least a perceived tension, right? And I think we are in Washington, right? So let's understand what the perception is within the town that we're in. But all of you are also traveling to a lot of different countries as well. And so I think, as Avi said, that national context, right, is also a really important factor to bring into the existence of that tension. So I have a question about some of the governance aspects of that. I'm not sure if it's something you've come across, but are the fundamental challenges of catalyzing investment in places that, as you said, Ethan, are going to be the future of energy growth really dependent on solving that tension about the model for development? Or is it really about some of those other governance issues, right? Is it really about more of the capacity to be able to build the projects, attract the finances? What is it? I mean, is it a tension in the selection of fuel sources, or is it really about the development model in theory in general? And anybody can jump in on this. So, Beth, you go.
I mean, I'll just say, I think obviously there is a tension, but it's possible that it's more of a tension up here than it is a tension on the ground, right? What people on the ground are looking for is access to energy. And they're interested in doing it in a cost-effective way, in a way that will be clean and healthy for their communities, and in a way that can be as quick as possible and as scaled as possible. And I think that this notion of context wipes away a lot of that tension eventually, not entirely, obviously, because there are tensions around how you get things done and where investment should be focused. The way we're a relentlessly context-focused organization. That's sort of our entire approach, and that's how we operate. And so when we go into a country, we're not going in saying we want to do this or we want to do that. And I think that plays out in the types of programs that we do. So in Liberia, where electricity is extremely expensive, and there was a major hydropower project that was already underway, we found out a way to plug into that with other donors, and then also focused on standing up an independent regulator. So it was sort of a mixture of things. But in Benin, our approach was quite different, and in fact, we have our largest off-grid investment that we've ever done in our portfolio in Benin. And in Ghana, which very much was poised to welcome the private sector if the conditions are correct, we have a completely different approach. So, I think what you need to do is you go into a country, you see how many people are on the grid or close to the grid, how many people are not never going to get reached by the grid, but are so far away from the grid that you need to find different solutions. And then what's the right mix of approaches and solutions to reach the maximum amount of people to increase productivity?
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, at OPIC, I agree with Ethan's observation. We look in both areas because, again, we're driven by the entrepreneur of on-grid and off-grid. Also at OPIC, we have an environmental mission, so which we've, again, had forever, and we've been doing all of our energy projects, albeit geothermal, solar, gas, heavy fuel oil, have to meet certain environmental standards. And again, with what Beth said, I think the tension with people who just want more reliable energy relatively inexpensively and cleaner for them and for the benefit of all of us is the objective, and I think what entrepreneurs are delivering on, and also government agencies, and but it is the off-grid, I think, is hugely important, and we put a lot of focus on it at OPIC.
Okay.
I agree, but I would start with the fundamental question, which is, what do the Africans want? What do the Tanzanians want? What do the Rwandans want when you when you talk to them, when you fly there to Kigali and to Dar es Salaam and to Madagascar, what do they want? And I think sometimes in Washington and in the United States as a whole, in our excitement, in our strong desire to work on projects in Africa, we forget to really focus on that fundamental question. In terms of the challenges sort of writ large, the issue is not that there's a paucity of projects available in sub-Saharan Africa. The real issue is, of course, there is a lack of bankable projects. And that's really the core issue. And the other core issue is it is important to focus on off-grid solutions, especially since a lot of these countries don't necessarily have a national grid the way that we have it here in the United States. But it's also just as important to focus on base load power. And so 20 megawatt projects are good, 10 megawatt biomass projects are good, and they are certainly worthwhile pursuing as a whole. But also, in terms of the need for electricity throughout the continent, it is so immense that you really need to focus on base load power in order to meet some of the goals outlined by the international community, Power Africa's goals outlined by President Obama, which are quite challenging, but they're making good progress in that regard. So I think it's focused on all those issues as well.
Pamela.
And I would just add to that. I thought I was going to hit the holy, the third rail, not the holy third rail, for God's sakes, but the third rail in talking about coal. And I'm glad you mentioned it earlier. I do think that when you're looking at, you've got to get this right in your head. Yes, we all want a cleaner environment. Absolutely, that's what my company invests in. That's where we want. That's what we're hoping to provide. But you also have to look at the reality of what these countries are going through. And they've got some tremendously, just the evolution of the leadership in these developing countries where you have, Indians coming back to work in the government and solve their problems. They're not coming anymore, as I said, with their hand out. They're coming in and saying, this is my challenge, deal with it. And the Indians have been unabashedly, pro-coal. They are going to use it. That provides their baseload power. They have 300 million people without power, and they need to deliver it soon, quickly. And what worries me when I look at that situation is that if development banks take the opinion or take the position that we will only fund these types of projects, it doesn't mean that India's not going to use coal. It means they're going to still use the indigenous resource, but probably with a lesser technology. So now you've got them committed to a lesser technology coal project or lesser technology upgrade, and that plant's going to be there for another 30 to 40 years. And that's worrying. What we like to do is package some solutions together. We know they're going to do coal. We know they also want to do renewables. How do we bring it together so that they can get higher efficiency coal that uses less of the resource, produces more energy, and then integrate it with the grid? And on the issue of the cost going down on renewables, absolutely true. But when you're talking about these developing countries, if they have a grid, it is so fragile. Making that connection is a challenge that you just can't avoid. You've got to take head on.
Talking about bankable projects and that what you're saying about the grid makes me think about, the real challenge in the energy space is we've got, communities of people, one of whom is sort of techno-optimists, right? A lot of real great techno-optimists who understand what the electric power system or the liquid fuel system can and always has been able to deliver, but they need to be able to have the sort of commercial environment that enables that. And sometimes there appears to be a bit of a mismatch between sort of what is a bankable project now and what is the enabling environment to get to a more advanced system down the line. That seems to be kind of another core challenge that that the industry continues to face, globally, is that you're right. I think these countries do actually want to be able to use their indigenous resources, or the resources that they at least have the system to be able to use. Right. But at the same time, they would like to be able to have an advanced method of being able to sort of leapfrog or advance to the sort of next more advanced stage. It's hard to do that, especially with. Maybe what I'd like to just ask one more question about, and then I'm going to go to all of you because I know you all have a lot of insights to provide and questions to ask. It strikes me in some of the countries that I've worked in, either in this job or in my last job at the Department of Energy, that the other thing we're sort of plagued by that we don't really talk about, we talk a lot about policy, we talk a lot about the development community, but the underlying economic conditions are often the thing that creates this fits and starts sort of mentality in a lot of places, right? Whereas when the economy is growing and energy demand is high, there's a lot of room for building infrastructure, investing in projects. The creditworthiness of all of this is much more bullish. You can find a lot of activity, whether it's in new oil and gas development, plus power generation, plus a whole lot of things. And then when the economy slows again, it becomes hard to sustain those things. Pamela, you said something earlier about sort of the creativity that people are bringing to the table to solve some of these long-standing solutions. I just wondered if any of you have seen the kind of creativity in some of the places where you work that is really designed to try and get beyond the sort of fits and starts economic trajectory of this all. Because I think it's something that developing community experiences, but quite frankly, you see it here happen in the United States as well, right? I mean, we have projections for what we think is possible for transforming the U.S. economy and energy sector. That if we were growing really fast, we would be able to do very well. But if we'll be growing slowly, it's going to take a different approach. I mean, does that get appreciated in some of your work? Yes, please.
Because OPIC is by definition, because we cannot compete with the private sector. We are a counter-cyclical investor. With our finance in particular, we're also a political risk insurance provider. And again, speaking broadly, always bankable projects, the challenge. OPIC works in probably 140 countries that are emerging markets. Over our history, the power projects that have performed the best have actually been in the more vulnerable economies, because the project has been more important to the entire country. So I always sit here, as we get into the better economies in our market, those are actually the more challenging deals.
Interesting.
It's the importance of the asset and the alignment of the interests that over time, which goes to, again, good governance, good entrepreneurs, delivering a reliable product, that actually makes a difference.
That's interesting. Anybody else want to get on that?
I think it also has to go with corporate values. Private sector independent power producers, when they work in Africa, are obviously looking for a profit. But there's a difference between looking for a profit and looking for a fair profit. I think it's important for IPPs when they focus on investing in sub-Saharan African countries to really focus on a fair profit, perhaps not charging as much as they would elsewhere in the world, just because of the context. So that sort of corporate social value system, I think, should become more prevalent throughout sub-Saharan Africa in reference to some of the various companies and producers out there.
Yeah. Just want to interject. Yeah. Even allowing the private sector in is a reform. So not a great reform, but that in itself is reform.
The only thing I was going to say is that a bull market can cover up a lot of underlying governance issues. When things are really good, you can sort of sometimes afford to ignore some of the fundamental problems, and then when the economy slows down a bit, that's when all of those things sort of rise to the surface. And I would just say that in terms of increasing the atmosphere, or making the atmosphere better for innovation to happen, taking care of some of the underlying governance issues in a sector, and really shoring up the ability of that sector to support innovation and to welcome private sector innovation in is something that we find very important.
Okay, great. Did you want to add?
If you don't mind, I just wanted to touch on Algeria, because
Please.
I thought they were tremendously creative in the way they went forward with 2012, they did a mega deal, huge deal, 7 gigawatts of power. They knew they had the biggest power deal going in the world, and they were really smart about it. And they said, you know what, it's not just about getting energy, and they needed it desperately. What else can we get for this? And so they knew the traditional groups that would come, which included GE, Siemens, Alstom, big multinational companies, and they said, this is how we're going to play this. We're going to have 2 rounds. The first round is, what are you going to bring to us? And we had great conversations with them. And some of it was roads and infrastructure, but a lot of it was educating their SOE executives, helping them to think more like a private sector company, helping them become more entrepreneurial and innovative. And so all of our companies were challenged to come up with ideas, and some people came up with, bicycles that kids could ride to work. We really focused on the education side, and I think that was one of the reasons that we ultimately won the project. But they did it first, and they said, okay, of these, 2 of you can go on to the next level, and now we'll compete on technology. I thought it was really, it was brilliant and it was powerful. It was great to work on. I traveled through North Africa significantly through some very tough times, but I knew why I was going there, and it was completely worth it because we were going to change people's lives.
Okay. Do you want to say something?
I just wanted to actually come back on a different topic on technology. I don't consider myself a technology optimist or
Techno-optimist. No, and I wasn't accusing you
No,
of
I know
being
you weren't. I consider myself a techno-realist, and in reality right now we're seeing solar projects underbid fossil sources of generation. We're seeing people bidding to build it as low as 3 cents per kilowatt hour. I guess I would just contend that from the development perspective, I'll come back to the point I made earlier, this is not a choice that necessarily has to be made between the two anymore in terms of development versus clean energy. And in particular, when you're talking about people who are off the grid, we're getting them that coal-fired generation. Doesn't just mean building the power plant and buying the coal. It means delivering it to them and building all that transmission out to them. The economics of solar with a battery within the next 5 to 10 years will be there. And so, look, as an American taxpayer, I don't really want my government funding development banks that fund coal. I'm that concerned about climate change.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that, but what I'd like to see happen is maybe a balanced approach where, look at the other options that these countries are going to take and balance it out a little bit. And how about put a lot more money in making that optimistic, I do think it's optimistic that battery power will be there in 5 years. We're not seeing it. So I'd like to, honestly, if we're serious about this as a country, and the Europeans too, let's do a moonshot for energy storage. That's the solution. And we're investing,
we don't need to do
but not moonshot
We have
level.
something called the electric vehicle industry that is scaling up at a very quick pace and is driving down the price of batteries very quickly, which is going to benefit a lot of people beyond the automobile industry.
So there's a tension there, which quite frankly, not to be glib about it, is exactly why it makes it very hard to sort of have one reconciled position as any entity, a company, a government, a development bank, on this fundamental question. But I do think some of the things we talked about here is, fundamentally focusing on national context can often help alleviate some of the tension, right? Because you're talking about real project actualized on a real basis. And I think the challenge going forward is that, whether it is a battery that's going to emerge in 5 years or 1 to 10 years or however long that takes, the key is to be able to develop systems that are able to incorporate that learning, right? To be able to have those advanced systems, because we have a wonderful electric power grid here in the United States, but we hope every other one that ever gets built is better, right? So I think that's another innovation in the sort of process is really important to be able to keep a door open to. You've been wonderfully patient. I'm going to take 3 of your questions at a time so we can make sure we get a bunch in. I'm going to take 2 in the back and then 1 right here.
Yes, thank you. A very interesting panel.
Oh, and I'm sorry, could you
Alain Norman. I'm now at the Center for International Science and Technology Policy, GWU. So I sort of had a question. I first of all agreed greatly with the gentleman from Bloomberg that sort of decentralized or alternative energy has a lot of future. Number two, if I may say so, a lot of Africa and the Indian subcontinent will be very adversely affected by climate change. So I had a very specific, somewhat in the weeds question, and maybe the solution in part is about 2 billion plus years old, algae. How do you see perhaps algae technology complementing the development of coal use in a place like India to curb the GHG emissions, produce other products that can be sold, fertilizers, feed, cogeneration, whatever. Thank you.
Great, and right behind you. We're going to go to the gentleman in the yellow. There's a lot of questions, so I just want to try and get as many on the board as we can.
Hi, good afternoon. Emilio Bunge from Development Finance International. We work with a number of companies in energy in emerging markets. First, I wanted to bring energy efficiency. I think it didn't came in the all-in, so we can include that. Second one is, what are some of your institutions, particularly in the donor agencies, or what kind of monies are you tracking in Bloomberg in terms of technical assistance or project feasibility monies? Because there's a lot of money for projects, but there's not enough shovel-ready projects to go and invest. Third one, I would say, I think the argument of development and clean has been resolved, at least by the institutions, which are going to put $100 billion by 2020 on clean energy. Countries will still go and decide and build what they want, but I think if we had a discussion about the price of carbon and externalities, how will that impact the equation of the total life cycle cost of the projects? Thank you.
Great, 3 excellent questions. And then we're going to go right here to the gentleman in the front. I'm going to try again for another round if we can be quick with our responses, but
Thank you, Akbar Khwaja, former World Bank official. Thanks to the panel. United Flights recently started a combination of biofuel and traditional fuel. Would you comment on 5 years from now, what type of alternative energy will be using the airline industry? Thank you.
All right. So we had 3 questions. Two technically, one algae technology and coal, India in particular, the other one on airline fuels and the future thereof. And then the other ones were a basket of them, but I do think that maybe focusing on energy efficiency, since we didn't do that. I think carbon pricing may be a bridge a bit far from here, but not that it doesn't exist, but it's a big conversation. So, but maybe we could start on that. Does someone want to take a whack at the technical ones first with an orange tie? Or Pamela, would you like to do it?
Yeah,
You want me to give you a minute?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Because
I
mean,
don't have a lot to say on algae, but go ahead.
I was hoping to address the algae.
Okay, go ahead. It's all yours.
Look, I'm a government affairs background person. I did science and technology policy on the Hill before I came to GE. My first job in GE 15 years ago was working with the Global Research Center and the GE Global Research Center in upstate New York, as we were discussing earlier. And what we're doing there is so tremendous and so important. I mean, this is billions of dollars that a private company is putting into, and it's separate from my business. So it's separate from power. We get to go in and talk about some of the work we're interested in, but the improving the current technology works happens in the business's engineering department. What's happening in Niskayuna, New York is that we've got, and not just Niskayuna, New York, I should say, we've expanded, we've got 8 centers globally. But what's happening there is an investment by our company into these incredible scientists that we have around the world to come up with the craziest ideas. And I'm not saying algae's crazy, but I'm saying they get the freedom to test this out, to prove me wrong, to prove the CEOs wrong, that these are this is what's going to solve the problem. It's not going to be evolutionary. And I really love that about my company. They actually compete against one another with an outside panel that comes in and says, yeah, you've got it. And there's plenty of naysayers within the business, but that tension is really important, and that's what's going to drive the next level. And when it comes to fuel efficiency and fuel sources for air, we're all over that as well. So again, not a technologist, but I have a strong belief in hiring the smartest scientists we can get and giving them the license to explore beyond the boundaries of what my CEO's business plan is.
So I'll take a whack at biofuels, and also not a PhD in anything, but just to give you the history, at least as we've seen as a firm in terms of biofuels. I mean, basically, cellulosic ethanol has been, the fuel of the future, and it, for the last 10 years, and it might always be. In the sense that it is not, the prices have simply not come down for it to a level that is truly makes it anywhere on par with gasoline at the moment. Or in the case of jet fuels, they're definitely doing a lot of experimentation, and it'd be great to see that market grow. And the U.S. Department of Defense has been very supportive of a number of these things, as some of the airline makers and others. It could grow, but frankly, we're not terribly bullish about forecasting like a huge kind of ramp up. We're not nearly as optimistic as we are around electric vehicles as we are around solar in terms of the longer term. It's just, but not because I know the science so well, but just because we haven't seen the kind of progress that the industry was hoping for. And algae is another interesting area as well. And again, not one that I know a ton about. But there's been a lot of interest towards biodiesel with algae and other types of uses as well. And there's some potential there. But again, that's purely on the dollar per gallon or dollar per whatever unit you're going to use. They just haven't gotten the cost down yet. Not far enough.
Yeah, and just to add 2 cents on the alternative fuels piece, I do think it's really important to understand that for both algae and for alternative biofuels and airline transportation purposes, folks always sort of run to sort of a replacement mindset, right? Could it be a replacement for the liquid distribution system the liquid fuel system that we have in that case, or for the power generation source? And it's always very hard to get the cost and efficiency down to a level where it could compete like that. It's much more difficult when you're doing sort of supplements to the existing system, right? So that supplementary model is one of the things when we started the renewable fuel standard here in the United States, which I am not going to advocate as being a good policy or not on the stage. That's another big conversation. But those renewable fuel policies actually did get biofuels consumption globally up to a fairly high level, and it didn't replace the liquid transportation fuel system. So I think we routinely sort of run to this place where we think about them as alternatives in whole, whereas they can actually be quite significant in part. And so the economics are always very different when you're combining fuels like that, and it makes it a more interesting discussion. So you said you might have something to say on energy efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. So on energy efficiency and also on sort of deal preparation and creating more deals that are out there, we're I guess first on energy efficiency, we are increasingly building energy efficiency components into our compacts with our partner countries. And so, those components will go along with a generation, transmission, distribution project because we feel it's important, frankly. If there's going to be additional energy available, then people need to be informed about how to use it best, how to conserve it best, and some of that is behavior change and messaging work. It really, it's sort of a nice counterpoint to some of the hard infrastructure and then some of the more sectoral policy reform we're doing, which is really dealing directly with people and how they're actually using energy. So that's one thing. And I'll say on deal preparation, we're a donor agency that has grants, unlike OPIC. So OPIC has a very different set of tools that they use and a different approach. We have grant financing, which we know is increasingly rare in this environment and needs to be used as a precious resource. And we think that one way that it can be used as a precious resource is helping to bring deals to fruition. We're not going to replace the private sector, but are there areas where we can do viability gap financing? Are there areas where we can help with the preparation of model power purchase agreements so that we can create the environment where the private sector can then come in and make the big investment. But that's definitely something that's on our radar screen and we're working actively on.
Do you have anything?
Just very quickly, I think there's a real space for and potential for using alternative fuel sources as a major driving force for a local economy. Take, for example, a biomass power plant, right? That obviously needs a fuel source. Let's say you could develop a bamboo plantation, right, and use the bamboo as a source to power the power plant. So then the power plant operator is paying people, the farmers in the area, to grow bamboo, cleaner type of fuel source in that regard. So it injects money back into the economy, and it's high impact and quick impact because it's the farmers on the ground there. And you're providing them electricity. And it also gets to the point of, well, it's all well and good to build a power plant in X country, but will you get paid for developing that type of electricity? And that's really a question that you could spend a whole day on, quite frankly, no matter which part of the region of the world you're in.
Or just add on the technical assistance question. Look, I mean, putting aside whatever you think, whether I'm right or wrong in our discussion about how cheap, solar gets or doesn't, let's suppose it is cheap enough, right? You still need literally thousands, millions of people to actually make a distributed energy system occur.
Right.
And there's a lot of systemic inertia out there, that is going to make that challenging. And you literally need boots on the ground to just do this stuff. And so, yeah, I think investing in that kind of thing is just incredibly, incredibly important. I mean, I'm very excited because I feel like, we see a lot of younger people who are excited by these opportunities and want to get involved in doing more of this, and some who raise money privately, even like I said, from venture capital funds. So there's interest out there, but the size of the issue is just so enormous. There's got to be more good projects and good people doing those projects.
That's why I was getting back to, in my initial comments, just about, my company would love to just look at this as a power generation issue, or maybe the grid business look at it as a grid issue. But, you've got to get a lot of folks in the room. We're talking about, we're putting out some crazy ideas internally, so please don't tweet about it. Because no one has agreed to do this. This is just my team's crazy idea, but also trying to help the country figure out models that work for collection, because that's also part of it. So let's have a microgrid that provides solar, but you've also got to get that paid for. You've got to have collections go back to the country, and they're not good at it. They don't mind telling you they're not good at it. But have we provided a solution on that? No. Are we comfortable doing it? Not yet, not even close. But I think all of us have to work together to try to figure out a big solution, not just, okay, I figured out my piece of the solution.
Without getting to that one too much, but there are some of the more interesting solutions around that is taking place with mobile phone telephony and people literally paying.
That's right.
And on those little micro solar systems I was talking about earlier, in many cases, the person literally doesn't have this $75 to just buy the thing outright. So they put down $10, they take the system home, they get a certain number of hours on it, and then when they want more, they pay for it over their cell phone, and they get a new code sent back to them. They punch the code into the box, and they get another 10 hours of use on that solar system. So there is some sort of those are starting to emerge as remittance systems.
And wouldn't it be powerful if we could work together at the scale that GE can, generally puts out, and the innovation that you're describing? That would move the needle.
Well, listen, we have gone a little bit over time, and there's a couple panelists we've got who have a hard stop at 1. I know you've got a big sort of rest of the day. There's a coffee break now, but I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of the panelists for being here, and please join me in thanking them.